Welcome, and in this video course we are looking at the CyberOps Associate version 1 course. This course is going to cover the skills and knowledge needed for successfully handling the tasks and duties, responsibilities of an associate level security analyst working at a security operations center. The goal of this video series is to help prepare learners for the Cisco 200-201 certification that's focusing on understanding the Cisco Cybersecurity Operation Fundamentals course known as CBROPS. Module 13, Attackers and Their Tools. So in this module, we're going to be focusing on some of the general tools that an attacker would use. We're going to explain network threats and how they evolve. And again, we're going to describe the various types of attack tools used by different threat actors. So first of all, who is attacking a network? That's one of the big questions we have to be able to ask and answer. So oftentimes we look at what's called the threat, asset, and vulnerabilities. And where these three converge is known as risk. When we have a threat that could be realized, when we have a vulnerability that can actually be presented through that asset, and when we have that asset, that vulnerability, and that potential threat, where all three of them line up, that is where risk comes in. Attackers want to access the assets, and they do that by a vulnerability that is found, or an exposed threat that could be there. It could be intellectual property, it could be a device, it could be data, it could be passwords, it could be several different things. So with that said, we need to have a clear definition of 5 very specific key terms. Threat, that is a potential danger to an asset. The asset could be any type of asset, data, the network, a person, an object, a technology object. A vulnerability is a weakness in a system or a design that can be exploited by a threat. Again, threat being the danger to that asset. So a vulnerability is a weakness that could be exploited. Normally, you would cover exploit at that point, but there's also an attack surface. The attack surface is basically the total sum of vulnerabilities for a given system that are accessible. Basically, that's going to be more of the exposure. The more exposure of an asset, the more likely it is to be targeted, because there's more exposure, so that's more surface space for an attacker to attack. An exploit is the mechanism that you use to leverage the vulnerability to compromise the assets. Exploits can be remote, could be local, they could be code, they could be a privilege escalation, it could be anything. Again, the exploit is being able to leverage that vulnerability that is a weakness to gain access to that asset. Risk is the likelihood that a particular threat will be exploited by a particular vulnerability of an asset and a result for whatever consequences there are. Risk, how I like to describe risk, is likelihood of something occurring. Normally we look at it in the lens of a threat being exploited, but risk is likelihood, essentially. So what do we do? If we know there are threats out there, and we know that our systems have vulnerabilities, and we expose those vulnerabilities, and what do we do? How do we be okay with that? What we have to look at is risk. We look at what is acceptable, are we willing to deal with when it comes to types of risk. There typically are 4 main ways to manage risk. You can accept the risk, you can avoid the risk, you could reduce the risk, or you can transfer the risk. Oftentimes, we transfer the risk in terms of like insurance. You have a car. You can actually transfer the risk of an accident by getting car insurance. If you get into a car accident, all of that's paid through insurance. That is risk transfer. Risk transfer is basically the willingness to transfer to a third party, typically an insurance company. You could reduce the exposure to risk, and that's one of the more common acceptable types of risk management or risk mitigation. Basically, when you know these are the risks involved, you try to lessen them. You could avoid the risk altogether. Maybe you don't want to get a virus on your computer and you don't want to have antivirus, so you can avoid getting it by being more cautious on web content that you're viewing or things like that. Risk avoidance is basically just trying to avoid the exposure to risk by eliminating certain activities. Or you can accept a certain level of risk. So that's what's really funny here, is when we talk about managing risk, we're not talking an all or nothing. We're talking ways to mitigate. Maybe we want to reduce risk to more of an acceptable limits. So we look at our assets and we find ways to secure them the best that we can. So we basically reduce the risk of those assets until we get to an acceptable risk limit. Nothing is going to be 100%. The goal is to mitigate risk as much as we can to a more acceptable limit. So some other terms we need to be familiar with are going to be things like countermeasures and impact. A countermeasure is basically just action taken to protect that asset by mitigating the threat. An impact is going to be either the potential or the real damage to the organization that could be or is caused by the threat being realized. Typically, a local exploit will require inside network access to be able to run the exploit. A remote exploit will be one that will use external network resources like the internet. Hacker is a pretty common term. It's really just a clever way to describe a threat actor. A hacker has a variety of meanings. There are different types of hackers. There's different classification of hackers as well. So a hacker versus a cracker. One has intent, and oftentimes we use cracker is the one that we want to be using, but because of media, hackers kind of taken over that. So in here going forward, hacker is going to be the malicious type of individual. Well, does that mean all hackers are bad? Well, there's different types of hackers. A white hat hacker typically is a good hacker. They're an ethical hacker. They have permission. They do it on behalf of the organization or the group that owns the asset that they're checking. We have a black hat hacker. That's going to be more nefarious. That's going to be more ferocious. That's going to be more illegal. A gray hat is kind of a combination between the two. Is hacking illegal is essentially the main question. Hacking is not illegal. It's what you do and the intent that goes into play. For example, if you are attacking a website of a former employer, well, that's bad. That's illegal. That would be more the black hat. If you are testing a company's website after they've hired you and given you permission, that's going to be a white hat. So again, white hat hackers are ethical hackers. They're good. Gray hat, they're individuals that still commit crime and they still do unethical things, but it's normally for a good cause, and they often do not do personal gain, or they try to minimize damage. Black hat are unethical, criminal, they do bad stuff all around. So we're going to start using the term threat actor when we're referring to individuals or groups that could be classified as a hacker that's doing it more unethical or more illegal. More illegal, which doing it is illegal. So how did we get the word threat actor? Threat actor I mean, has been around for a while, but hackers and crackers have been around even longer. Hackers started in the 60s with phone phreaking, which basically means you play certain audios in a phone receiver and it would then process those sequences and allow you to do certain things. You broke into the system and you learned kind of how to bypass their security. So in the early 60s, threat actors realized by mimicking the tone, like whistling, they could exploit the phone switches to do free long-distance calling. In the 70s, they explored even further. Late 70s, further. 80s, they pushed limits. In the 80s, threat actors wrote war dialing programs, which basically dialed each telephone number in a given area to search for a computer, a bulletin board, a fax machine, and then they would exploit that number. When phone numbers was found, basically a password cracking program could then be used to gain access. So if you're trying to break into a fax machine, they would test all the numbers, find the fax machines. If it was a fax machine, then they would load a launcher program or a loader to execute certain code. So, are there multiple types of threat actors? We said hackers, but is that it? Well, we have script kiddies. Those are going to be people that don't really have a lot of experience, not always teenagers. Oftentimes, these are the more inexperienced security professionals or inexperienced workers that don't know any better. They know how to run the tool. They don't know what the tool does. They don't know how the tool fully works, but they know to do this task, you do this tool. You also have a vulnerability broker. Basically, this is kind of a gray hat hacker. They attempt to find exploits and they report them oftentimes for a reward. A bug bounty or a bug bounty hunter could also be a vulnerability broker. You also have hacktivists. They're like an activist, but do it through hacking. Again, typically a gray hat hacker, and they protest against something political or social injustices. And again, that's very general. There's more in depth for hacktivists, but again, think activist, but hacking. You have criminals. So you have the traditional cyber criminal. They're the black hats that kind of make money. Could be organized crime as well. But then you also have state-sponsored. That's where it gets kind of nasty. That's going to be a country that actually sponsors the hacker groups, and they may steal secrets, they may steal intelligence, they may commit corporate sabotage or government sabotage. They could do terrorist groups or espionage on corporations. State-sponsored is pretty much the bottom barrel cyber criminal that pretty much attacks for money or for some type of gain. Cyber criminals are going to be out there. That's a fact of life now. Cyber criminals are criminals or a threat actor who are motivated to make money. Cyber criminals, they don't have to work alone. They could work in groups. Though, oftentimes they do work alone because it's a little easier if one gets caught, if you're the only one in the group. They steal billions of dollars every year, and that number only increases. They typically operate underground, and they also operate with a hidden budget or hidden economies, and they buy and sell data on the internet or the dark web. They target businesses, small, medium, and large. They target consumers. They target industries, enterprises, governments, anyone that can pay. So oftentimes these threat actors, they will target anyone to be able to get money. So how do we mitigate them? We can do things like get trustworthy IT vendors, make sure that security and software is up to date, do pen tests to verify that your network is secure, harden your network, make sure we have backups, make sure we have default passwords changed, look at security policies and other policies and actually enforce them. Cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. It's no longer just IT. It's everyone in the organization needs to be responsible for their cybersecurity. It's no longer, oh, well, we have IT, it's their job. It's everyone's job. So, what do we know, or how do we figure out when we're compromised? We know we're compromised when we get some type of IOC, or indicator of compromise. This is typically evidence that the attacker has occurred, or that the attacker has gained access and has done something. Each attack is going to be very unique, and it's really hard to say this is going to be the events in a breach, because we don't know. Every breach is going to be different. IOCs can be identified malware. They could be IP addresses of a foreign server. They could be software installed. It could be a lot of different things. We also have an indicator of an attack, IOA. And this focuses more on the motivation and the strategy behind the attack, as well as how the attackers gained access. The IOAs help generate proactive, better preventative approaches or measures that can be reused in a later time to mitigate the attack next time or in the future. The nice thing is we also have organizations that share information. We have things like the CISA that uses the automated indicator sharing system. Basically, it shares things between government entities. We have the European Union Agency. We have the National Cybersecurity Alliance Agency. We have the National Cybersecurity Awareness Month that raises awareness about cybersecurity. We have corporate partnerships that work with federal government, that work with state government and local government to share all of the different events. The big thing here is threat sharing has to occur. Once an organization figure out that a threat is happening or is possible, they need to share it with other groups so that everyone could be on the same page. If one organization knows about a possible threat that no one else knows about, how can the other organization start protecting themselves if they don't know that threat is going to be there? So you have to own IT, you need to secure IT, and you need to protect IT. And this was the theme for the Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Understanding that cybersecurity belongs to all of us. That means understanding social media, understanding our policies, our software, our passwords, all of that needs to be up to date and kept current. That way, we can make sure a certain level of protection occurs. With that, we can then start talking about the tools that hackers may use. Basically, the sophistication of the tools are pretty low. The nice thing is the technical knowledge is getting more complex. Again, a script kiddie can find tools on the internet and can run them. So the sophistication of the tool may be high, where the technical knowledge of the individual could be kind of low. As we get into the 21st century, 2021, 2022, and so on, the sophistication of the attacks are only going to increase, even if the technical knowledge of the person doing the attack is lowering. Again, all of the tools are out there for attackers to use. You can find the tools on YouTube or on GitHub or through other avenues. Running the tool isn't necessarily overly hard. Understanding how the tool functions is totally separate, however. So, tools evolve. Oftentimes people go, oh, well, I use Kali Linux. Well, Kali Linux in 2018 is different than Kali Linux 2019, which is totally different than 2021 or the 2022 versions of Kali Linux. The tools, they change every year. Some tools are kept in, while other tools may be removed or modified or added or updated. That way, we're having these dedicated operating systems with the up-to-date versions of these tools. Basically, all of this is to validate security and to have a platform us to do the validation from. So we can have tools like password crackers. That's going to be like John the Ripper. We can have wireless hacking tools. That's going to be things like Kismet or AirCrackNG. Our reconnaissance tools or our scanning tool. That's going to be like Nmap. We can have packet crafting tools. That's going to be like HPing or Scapping. We could have sniffers like Wireshark. Rootkit detectors. That's going to be things like our NetFilter. We could have fuzzers to search for vulnerabilities. That's going to be like Skipfish. Our fuzzers for vulnerabilities could also be a vulnerability scanner. In our tool set, we also have digital forensics tools. That can be like SleuthKit or Autopsy. We also have kits and tools for like debugging or encryption-based tools. Again, hacking operating systems like Kali Linux. We could have things like vulnerability exploit tools like Metasploitable or Metasploit. We have our vulnerability scanners. Those are also equally important. We can't really find all the vulnerabilities unless we have the tools to scan for those vulnerabilities. If we know there are X amount of vulnerabilities, we're not going to manually test all of them. We're going to get a scanner that can do the testing on our behalf. That way we can make sure that the tests are ran and we get a nice report saying where our weak links are. Tools can be all different types of classification and combinations. We could have data modification attacks or spoofing attacks or eavesdropping attacks or reconnaissance attacks. It really just depends on what we're trying to accomplish. The main three categories are eavesdropping, data modification, and spoofing-based attacks. But these aren't the only ones. We have password-based attacks or DDoS attacks or DOS attacks. We have man-in-the-middle attacks. That's where we have a threat in the middle between our source and destination that might capture all the traffic and then relays it as necessary. We have compromised key attacks. So when we're looking at encryption, if we are doing a compromised key attack, encryption is kind of moot at that point, because are the keys that are used in the encryption process, are they vulnerable? And oftentimes that can be. We have a sniffer attack, and that could be just an application that reads or monitors the network for data packets. So that actually is a quick, brief overview of the tools that hackers use. So in this chapter, we looked at network security, we looked at risk management, we looked at managing risk and mitigation techniques, we looked at key terms, we looked at different forms of hackers, we looked at both IOC and IOAs, indicators of compromise and indicators of attacks. We looked at kind of their functionality and kind of how they work and where we can use that data. We looked at different categories of tools, and we looked at categories of attacks. That is it for this chapter. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out. Again, with this material, being able to ask questions and discuss some of the topics in the lecture help build long-term retention, so do not be afraid to communicate with this topic. Again, I'm here if you need anything. Thank you.